Russia's Vladimir Putin and North Korea's Kim Jong-un, a match made in hell. Recently, the two leaders announced they would be entering into an alliance similar to what the former Soviet Union held with the isolationist nation while Kim's grandfather was in power. This promised team-up has sent shockwaves around the world, but ultimately this alliance could do a lot more harm than good to both sides. But how did we get here? The move is actually rather surprising, given that Putin happily signed on to every sanction that the UN has slapped on North Korea in the past. This probably made it pretty awkward between Putin and Kim as they drove around town together in the car that Putin gifted the Russian dictator. But the two seemed to brush off past embarrassments, like two BFFs heading to world domination brunch. But despite the fact that Russia previously supported sanctions against North Korea as the dictatorship worked to develop its nuclear weapons, Russia is trying to repair the relationship now. Why the change of heart? Easy. The war in Ukraine. If Russian forces manage to break Ukrainian front lines, it would have to make a choice: continue its invasion and run right into EU-backed, NATO-backed French forces, provoking not just France's entry into the war, but the possibility of France's powerful allies, or stop its offensive in its tracks. Here's where there are some parallels with North Korea. The U.S. already has forces stationed in the Korean Peninsula. U.S. soldiers have had a presence there since the end of the Korean War, and currently have about 30,000 deployed for land, air, and sea. However, like with Russia versus Ukraine, this force is dramatically outnumbered by the 1 million soldiers Kim has at his disposal. The U.S. forces are again a tripwire force meant to deter conflict, with the promise that if those forces are engaged, it will provoke America's full-force entry into a war. And the same can be said if French troops were triggered by Russian advancement in Ukraine. If the U.S. entered a war against North Korea, its NATO and world allies could come with them. France did not end up sending troops to the Ukraine, and while U.S. aid came entirely too late, the moment the weapons, ammo, and equipment got into the hands of the Ukrainians, the results were immediate. With over 3 million shells delivered, Ukrainian artillery was once more able to engage Russian troops with extreme prejudice, staunching the literal and proverbial bleeding of Ukraine's front lines they'd been sustaining for months. Russian forces have largely been stopped in their tracks, with only minor advances across the areas that have practically zero strategic relevance. Putin's problems could continue because not all of the Americans' aid has been delivered. Such a massive aid package will take time to fully mobilize and get to the front. So what Russia has had to deal with is but a fraction of what's coming. Adding to Putin's woes are massive new aid packages from the EU, shoring up the American aid to Ukraine. And then there's the recent push to use the frozen Russian funds to directly finance Ukraine, creating a sort of "why are you hitting yourself" scenario for the Russian Federation. While Russia is importing Chinese and North Korean military equipment, Ukraine is getting the top-shelf stuff from the U.S. and other supporters. The quality disparity between Western arms and those Russia is receiving from its so-called allies is significant. For one, Western shells aren't exploding in artillery barrels, destroying weapons, and killing or wounding anyone nearby, as has been repeatedly documented from the North Korean shells. Another stunning setback for Russia came this summer when President Biden and other Western leaders gave the green light for Ukraine to use Western arms inside of Russia itself, and not just within Ukraine. This had been a line that the West insisted Ukraine not cross since the start of the war, a decision that was criticized as stupid and self-sabotaging. Russia, knowing that Ukraine could not strike its forces inside of its own borders, has long moved troops and equipment with impunity along its shared border with Ukraine. It has set up massive staging areas and supply depots right on the border, protected by nothing but the West's continued fear of Russian escalation. Until recently, that is. The Russia-Ukraine war is not the first time. The U.S. has taken a stance on not targeting bases inside the aggressor's country. Some inside the American defense and intelligence communities have argued that, in case of war with China, the American military should not strike at bases inside of China, apparently out of fear of escalation. This despite China almost certainly striking not just at U.S. ships in the South China Sea, but also U.S. naval and air bases across the Pacific should war break out. Other experts and analysts have pushed back, noting that as long as the enemy can continue to reconstitute its forces and organize logistics safely, victory is all but impossible. Thus they argue that to ensure a swift defeat of China, U.S. forces must have targets inside China itself for long-range weapons and airstrikes. As Russia desperately tries to avoid another major mobilization with disastrous political and military results, it has even ramped up the already generous pay packages offered to volunteers. These pay packages have been particularly attractive to the ethnic minorities inside of Russia, such as the Chechens, Avars, and Tatars, who could make much more in a single year as a soldier than in other jobs. But the populations of ethnic minorities, rural Russians, and military-aged men who haven't already volunteered is running low, and pressure to recruit from cosmopolitan Russian cities like Moscow and Novosibirsk is growing. These centers of Russian power and culture have purposefully been left largely alone. Until now, after all, a grieving mother from Moscow whose son just got turned into a blood mist by a AIMAR can still cause as much trouble as a farmer from Gorbachev. Another source of manpower is also running low for Russia as well. Prison inmates, stealing the trick from the infamous Wagner Group mercenaries. The Russian military went all in on recruiting convicts who were then given the most dangerous assaults meant to weaken Ukrainian defenses or fix them so that regular Russian units could then finish the job. The tactic was sadistically effective, and casualty counts amongst prisoners is sky-high, essentially killing two birds with one stone, as Russia would see it. Yet these prisoner populations have started to dry up, prompting Russia to start recruiting female prisoners for the front lines too, as evidenced by captured Russian soldiers rounded up by Ukraine. And here is why Putin has been buddying up to Kim recently, because he doesn't just need North Korean weapons. He needs hands to put the weapons into. It's been long speculated that North Korea might send combat troops to Ukraine, and with a military that reportedly includes 1.3 million soldiers, a percentage of North Korean women are required to serve 7 years, and all North Korean men are conscripted for 10 years. An influx of North Korean soldiers could significantly affect the front lines. Some have even posited that the only option left for NATO would be to send combat troops of its own. For now, though, this does not appear to be the case, though allegedly Kim Jong-un did make the offer to Putin during his visit. It was widely reported in June 2024 that North Korea would be sending engineers and construction troops instead of soldiers to Ukraine to work in the occupied territories where Russia has a great need to shore up the infrastructure. These troops could also be used to build military fortifications for the Russian military, freeing up huge amounts of Russian manpower and making the Ukrainian counter-assault more difficult in the future. However, there is no indication, as of the initial release of this video, that North Korea would actually be sending any troops, soldiers or otherwise. We already know that North Korea has been a strong supporter of Russia's war. It was amongst the first to recognize occupied territories like Crimea and those at the borders that Russia currently holds as part of Russia. And it's estimated that the nation has sent 7,000 railway cars full of supplies and raw goods to support Russia's war. Kim likely sees the entry of North Korean troops into the war as a positive. This would be an opportunity for North Korean military leaders to get their first taste of war in over half a century since the end of the Korean War. And even just the task of sorting out logistics in a wartime setting could be instructional. Of even greater value to Kim, however, is what it is trying to get from Russia in return. What Russia is offering North Korea in exchange for its aid, other than money, is unknown. And this is troubling for those on the other side of this fight. It's believed that North Korea is looking to get its hands on modern Russian equipment, a move that has alarmed both the US and South Korea. Putin has long threatened to send weapons to North Korea, and as the nation's support ramps up, it's clear that Kim will expect something big in return. What's most likely is that Russia will send modern air defense equipment and perhaps even fighter and strike aircraft, two critical needs for a nation still operating early to mid-Cold War aircraft and air defenses, while Russian equipment in Ukraine hasn't proven to be as spectacular as once touted before the war. It has still been adequate for the job. Its presence in the Korean peninsula would complicate Allied air operations in case of war in that region. Access to modern aircraft would also pose a more direct challenge to U.S. stationed troops in South Korea and South Korean forces during the opening stages of a war. It's almost certain that Russia has already provided technical assistance to North Korea's space program, allowing the nation to launch its first spy satellite in November 2023. After years of failure, the sudden success is seen as extremely suspicious to many, but the real concern is if Russia has or will transfer rocket technology. While Russian rocket technology can be used to put heavier and more capable payloads into orbit, it is a dual-use technology that can also be used to increase the range, accuracy, and capabilities of North Korea's nuclear arsenal. And here is the major flaw at the center of the Russian-North Korean alliance. Nobody, not even China, wants to see the world's least favorite bad boys get together. The alliance between the two rogue states threatens no one more than South Korea, and South Korea has turned out to be a terrible nation to threaten. When it comes to economic power, Russia is ranked 11th in terms of global GDP rankings. South Korea is 14th, and the reported numbers for Russia might not be accurately reflecting its economy after 2 years of war and frozen foreign finances, which could put the two countries even closer in financial power. To date, South Korean aid to Ukraine has been non-lethal, with a national policy that forbids it from supplying weapons to countries engaged in a war. Yet, after Putin's visit to North Korea, South Korea's President Yoon Suk-yeol announced that the nation would reconsider its position on lethal aid. South Korea could provide significant amounts of lethal aid to Ukraine, given its healthy and growing defense industry that produces superior tanks, artillery, and infantry fighting vehicles. The nation has already indirectly provided weapons to Ukraine in the form of artillery shells, which were donated to the United States, freeing up U.S. stock to be shipped to Ukraine. If more substantial North Korean assets enter into the Ukraine war, this could provoke a South Korean response. This could lead to a sort of proxy conflict between Russia/China and Ukraine/South Korea happening in Europe's backyard. An influx of South Korean weapons and equipment would have a sizable effect on the battlefield, not to mention further souring already strained relations between Seoul and Moscow. Russia also faces significant international backlash for its support of North Korea. If it can be proven that it has indeed assisted the North Korean space program, provided any technical aid for North Korean nukes, or if, in the future, it sends weapon systems to North Korea, it would be a flagrant violation of the UN-backed sanction against them. Russia's geopolitical position could become even more isolated. Sanctions that may have been lifted at the end of a war with Ukraine could instead be enforced long-term as punishment upon the Russian Federation. Even its position as a permanent member of the UN Security Council would be under threat. Though it's unlikely the UN would actually give Russia the well-deserved boot. Then there's the variable that is China. North Korea has been a useful proxy for China to keep the West, and specifically America, South Korea, and Japan, off balance. For decades, North Korea has been China's dog on a leash, meant to let loose and complicate a response to Chinese actions such as an invasion of Taiwan. But Russia's growing ties with North Korea threatens to shift the embattled nation out from under China's influence, something North Korea is eager for, given its resentment over China's control. Deepening energy and trade ties would allow North Korea to shake off the Chinese leash and grant it a degree of independence. The fact that Russia has already proven willing to provide the type of assistance that China has denied only makes the prospect more enticing for North Korea. But China is nothing if not a control freak and wouldn't let a wild card like North Korea go so easily. China has its own interests in the region, and many of those interests are north in Russian territory. Chinese mapmakers have begun issuing new maps with Chinese names for territory Russia took from China in a series of lopsided treaties over a century ago. These annexed regions are rich with resources, ones that China desperately needs to lessen its dependence on sea trade, something that the U.S. Navy is positioned to choke off in case of war. Russia and North Korea's alliance may bring some temporary benefit to each nation, but it's unlikely to provide anything of long-term value to either side. Instead, it only isolates each country even further and will irrevocably harm Russia's ability to rejoin the world stage long after the war in Ukraine is done. For more on what your life would be like in North Korea, watch Daily Life of a North Korean, or check out our other military and world politics videos.